Soon I could tell by the sound of the steps it was my father. His walk was slower, heavier, more deliberate. My mother tended to move up the stairs in a sprint. He lightly knocked on the door and slowly turned the knob. The door opened slightly, and he peeked in. His easy half smile, almost a look of innocent curiosity, assured me that, at least for now, the beating would wait. "Hey, maid man, you mind if I come in?" I'm told that he had many terms of endearment for me, but maid man is the one I remember. I didn't even look up, but nodded slowly. He had to duck to clear the low doorway. He picked me up and, as he sat on the bed, placed me on his lap. As I sat there, all of my anxiety released. I could not have felt safer, more secure. He began to explain what I did wrong and why my mother was so angry. "Maid man, you can't just hit people, and particularly women. You must defend them, not fight them. Do you understand?" I nodded, then asked, "Is Mommy mad at me?" "No, Mommy loves you like I love you. She just wants you to do the right thing." My father and I sat talking for another 5 minutes before he led me downstairs to apologize to my sister and my mother. With each tiny step I took with him, my whole hand wrapped tighter around his middle finger. I tried to copy his walk, his expressions. I was his main man. He was my protector. That is one of only 2 memories I have of my father. The other was when I watched him die. My dad was his parents' only son. Tall but not physically imposing, he dreamed of being on television, having a voice that made an impact. Armed with an insatiable desire to succeed and aided by his natural gifts, which included a deeply resonant voice, he soon made his dream come true, soon after finishing up at Bard College in 1971. As a young reporter, he went to many corners of the country, following a story, or in many cases following a job. After stints in North Carolina, New York, Florida, Virginia, California, and a handful of other states, he returned home to Southern Maryland and started to work at a job that would change his life. He finally had the chance to host his own public affairs show, and he'd hired a new writing assistant. Her name was Joy. Their working relationship devolved quickly into a courtship, then love. She appreciated this up-and-coming reporter and the professional partnership they shared. Wes was calm, reassuring, hardworking, and sober. In other words, the antithesis of Bill. Wes was intensely attracted to this short woman with a broad smile, who mixed the steel backbone with Caribbean charm. And he loved Nikki. Despite her not being his own child, he forged a sincere friendship and eventually an unbreakable bond with Nikki. It all became official when my mother and father married in a small ceremony in Washington, D.C. I entered the world 2 years later. On April 15, 1982, my father ended his radio news broadcast on WMAL, a stalwart in the Washington, D.C. market, with his traditional sign-off. "This is Wes Moore. Thanks again, and we'll talk next time," as the on-air light faded to black. His smile was hiding the fact that for the past 12 hours he'd been feeling ill. His every breath was a struggle. He came home to the smell of his favorite meal, smothered lamb chops. It was almost midnight, and we kids were already in bed, but my parents stayed up, sat together, and ate. That night he couldn't get to sleep. He tried taking Tylenol, hoping it would help his severe sore throat and fever, but the pill lodged in his throat, refusing to dissolve. At 7 a.m., he woke my mother to tell her he thought he should go to the hospital. He threw on a tattered blue flannel shirt and a pair of worn blue jeans. He got in his Volkswagen Rabbit and drove himself to the hospital. After my mother took Nikki to school and dropped Shani and me off with the babysitter, she rushed to meet my father. In the emergency room, she was shocked by the disoriented man before her. My father could not keep his eyes open. His head flopped from side to side. The doctors thought the cause of his discomfort was a sore throat and blamed his lack of neck control on a lack of sleep. To reduce the pain, they anesthetized his throat. In retrospect, that was the worst thing they could have done. He could no longer feel it closing. The doctors didn't know what to make of his symptoms. They questioned my mother about my father's medical history, then shifted to questions about his mental state. Does he have a habit of exaggerating? Is there anything going on in his life that would force him to make up symptoms? At 4:40 p.m., my father was released from the hospital and told to get some rest at home. By 6 that evening, my mother was in the kitchen with Nikki, holding Shani as she cooked potato pancakes for our dinner. I sat at the table, adding colors to the black and white clown in my coloring book. I was months away from my 4th birthday. I heard my father coming down the stairs. His steps were slower than usual. I got up from the chair so I could be picked up as soon as he reached the 1st floor. Then I heard the crash. His body was sprawled and writhing at the foot of the stairs. Hardly any sounds came from his mouth. I heard another crash, this one from the kitchen. The clatter momentarily stole my attention from my father. My mother heard his collapse and in her rush to see what had happened, dropped the sizzling cast-iron skillet and the potato pancakes on the floor. I looked back up to my father and saw him gasping for air, holding his throat. His normally strong features sagged in exhaustion, as if he were in the final hours of a battle he had been fighting for years. I stared at him, looking but doing nothing. Mommy pushed past me and told Nikki to call 911. Nikki rushed the phone and began speaking with the emergency personnel on the other end. I could hear her repeating again and again, "I don't know what county we're in." Minutes passed. Shani was crying hysterically. My mother attended to my father, improvising her own version of CPR while also minding Shani. My baby sister's screams only seemed to get louder, and I just stood there, staring. Finally, my mother told me to go outside with Nikki and guide the ambulance crew in. My older sister took my hand and led me out to wait. Minutes later, police and ambulance crews arrived. Nikki ordered me to stay outside while she led them into our home. At this point, my memories get less distinct. It was like standing in a field when a powerful gust of wind suddenly blows. Everything around you vanishes. All you hear is the wind filling your ears. All you feel is the wind on your skin. Your eyes tear and sight blurs, your mind all but empties. I stayed outside with the collection of neighbors who had come to see what was going on. Through my uncertain eyes, I saw my friend Ayana holding her mother's hand. When Ayana caught my eye, I could see she was trying to force a smile, but all she got out was a look of uneasy confusion, which I mirrored back to her. The ambulance crew loaded my father onto the gurney and raced back out. By this point, dozens of people lined the streets. They watched as he was placed in the back of the ambulance, the doors slammed shut behind him. The loud sirens and flashing lights broke the silence of the neighborhood. Mommy quickly loaded us into the car and followed the ambulance to the hospital. The car was full of sound, Shani crying, and Nikki making goo-goo noises to try to calm her down, and the roar of the ambulance in front of us, but it felt as silent as a tomb. No talking, no questions, just the white noise of the ambulance, one sister crying and the other struggling to comfort her without words. The hospital was only 5 minutes from where we lived, but it seemed like a long ride. We rushed out of the car and ran inside. They were already working on my father, so we were sent to the waiting area. Shani had quieted down and was playing with her shoestrings while Nikki put me on her lap. My paternal grandfather and aunts, Dawn, Tawana, and Evelyn, had all arrived to join our vigil. Eventually, an ER doctor walked into the waiting room. He asked to see my mother alone. "He's dead, isn't he?" my mother said before he could begin speaking. "I'm sorry. By the time he got here, he was gone," the doctor said. We tried hard. I am so sorry." Then my mother passed out. My father was dead 5 hours after having been released from the hospital with the simple instruction to get some sleep. The same hospital was now preparing to send his body to the morgue. My father had entered the hospital seeking help, but his face was unshaven, his clothes were disheveled, his name unfamiliar, his address not in an affluent area. The hospital looked at him askance, insulted him with ridiculous questions, and basically told him to fend for himself. Now my mother had to plan his funeral. He died on a Friday night. We were told at first that the hospital would be unable to determine the cause of death until Monday, when they would perform an autopsy. But my father's radio station wanted to issue a news release about his death, so they leaned on the morgue to perform the autopsy sooner. The morgue acquiesced, and so by Sunday afternoon we found out that he had died from acute epiglottitis, a rare but treatable virus that causes the epiglottis to swell and cover the air passages to the lungs. Untreated because of the earlier misdiagnosis, my father's body suffocated itself. Nikki took his death worse than the rest of us. Not just because she was the only one old enough to really understand what was going on, but because her biological father, Bill, changed abruptly after my father died. While my dad was alive, Bill supported Nikki financially and took the time to see her. But after my father died, Bill no longer called, wrote, or bothered to check up on her. My father's love of Nicky had forced Bill to step up his parenting responsibilities. It was almost as if Bill cared more because another man did. With my father no longer in the picture, the pressure was off. It was as if my sister lost two fathers that day. While I knew something bad had happened, I still wasn't sure what it meant. All weekend, people came in waves to our home. The phone rang nonstop. I saw the hurt on people's faces, but didn't fully understand it. I was in the wind tunnel. I heard what my father had passed on, but I had no idea where he'd gone. At the funeral, my Uncle Vin escorted us to the mahogany casket in front of the church to have our final viewing of the body. The celebration of my father's life took place at the 14th Street Baptist Church, the same church my parents had been married in 6 years earlier. We stood in front of my father's body for the final time. He lay in the casket with his eyes closed. It was the first time I'd seen him in days. He looked more serene than he appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at peace. I was holding my Uncle Vin's hand when I looked into the casket and asked my father, "Daddy, are you coming home with us?"